Today, we're really getting into something significant. The practical challenges, the criticisms that popped up when Marxist economic and political ideas were actually tried out in the real world.
Exactly. And our goal here isn't just to list problems, but to understand why. Why this, well, often huge gap between the theory, the ideals, and the actual outcomes we saw historically. We'll be looking at specific examples, historical analysis.
Right, digging into the reasons behind things like systemic economic issues, the way incentives sometimes just disappeared, and how authoritarianism seemed to consistently emerge, often leading to, well, terrible human rights situations.
It's a complex picture, for sure.
So let's start with the economics. When these systems were implemented, what was the typical model? What were they trying to achieve?
Okay, so typically you see what's called a command economy, right?
Yeah.
Central planning. The core idea, the promise, was that a central authority could allocate all resources efficiently and fairly, sort of bypassing the messiness of free market supply and demand.
Like the Soviet five-year plans.
Precisely. Those are a classic example. Setting targets for everything from steel production to, green harvests.
But that sounds incredibly difficult. Where did the problems start to show up?
Well, the biggest one, consistently, is what you could call the information problem. How does a central committee know exactly what's needed everywhere, all the time? How do you forecast demand for millions of items?
Without market prices telling you what's scarce or desired.
Exactly. Market prices act like signals, constantly adjusting. Central planning, our sources show, was just inherently bad at forecasting. You'd get massive shortages of essentials or weird surpluses of things nobody wanted because they were working with incomplete, often outdated information.
And this links to that famous critique, doesn't it? The economic calculation problem.
Yeah.
I think Ludwig von Mises really formalized this.
Yes. Mises hit the nail on the head. His argument was basically, without private ownership of the means of production, factories, machines, land, you can't have real market prices for those things.
Okay.
And without those prices, you can't make rational economic decisions. How do you know if building a new tractor factory is a better use of resources than, say, producing more fertilizer if you don't know the true cost and value of the steel, the labor, the fuel involved?
So you're sort of flying blind economically.
Pretty much. And then there's the motivation aspect. If rewards aren't really tied to effort or innovation and state companies can't really fail, well, what drives people?
Yeah, the incentive structure. What happens to productivity?
It tends to fall. John Stuart Mill talked about the natural indolence of people needing competition. When you remove private property, you also remove a lot of that personal stake, that drive to innovate, to be efficient, to take care of resources. It's a fundamental human behavior challenge, you could say.
And the results? Historically, they've been devastating. You mentioned China's Great Leap Forward earlier.
Oh, absolutely catastrophic. Between 1958 and 62, estimates are, 20 to 45 million deaths, starvation, forced labor, executions, driven by unrealistic targets, those infamous backyard steel furnaces, and officials terrified to report bad news.
That's awful. And you still see economic struggles, though maybe different in scale, in places like Cuba and North Korea today.
Indeed. So as these economic models struggled, the political side often became harsher, didn't it? How did regimes maintain control?
Well, this is where the shift towards authoritarianism really kicks in. Lenin's interpretation of Marx was crucial here. Marx thought the revolution would be more spontaneous, from the workers themselves.
Right.
But Lenin, he didn't trust that. He believed you needed a disciplined group, an elite vanguard party to lead the workers, to sort of force consciousness onto them.
So creating a new center of power right from the start.
Exactly. And that theoretical dictatorship of the proletariat workers' rule very quickly became the dictatorship of the party. All power got concentrated in this small group.
Which is the opposite of Marx's idea that the state would eventually just wither away.
Completely the opposite. You ended up with totalitarian states trying to control everything.
Yeah.
Speech, thought, work, life.
And the tools used for that control, well, where they were brutal. Censorship, constant surveillance by secret police, torture, the gulags, vast forced labor camps, mass executions. Think of the Holodomor in Ukraine, the Great Purge under Stalin. Millions affected.
And the ideology itself, the idea of class struggle, was often twisted to justify this violence, wasn't it?
Tragically, yes. It became a rationale for eliminating entire groups deemed enemies of the people.
And it connects back to the economic failures, too. The mass famines weren't just accidents. They were often direct results of these policies. We mentioned China.
And you absolutely have to mention Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, 1975 to 79. Their attempt to create a purely agrarian communist state, the Mohalau Plow, it led to the death of maybe 1.5 to 3 million people.
Almost a quarter of their population.
Yes, from starvation, disease, forced labor, executions. It's just a horrifying example of ideology completely detached from reality and human cost.
So looking back across these different attempts, these different countries, what are the core takeaways? Why these consistent patterns of failure?
I think it boils down to a few key things we've touched on. First, the sheer inefficiency of central planning, that calculation and information problem, is just immense. Second, the lack of individual incentives really undermines productivity and innovation.
Okay.
Third, this tendency towards authoritarianism, partly to manage the economic failures and partly from that vanguard party idea, leading to horrific human rights abuses. And fourth, underpinning much of this, is the abolition of private property, which removes those vital price signals and personal accountability.
It's a stark picture. Yet it's interesting. Even with all these profound failures in practice, many scholars would say Marx's original critique of capitalism, his analysis of class, of commodification, that still offers valuable ways to understand inequalities we still see today.
That's a fair point. The analysis can be separated to some extent from the prescribed solution and its historical outcomes.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a big question, I think. What does this history tell us about the immense difficulty of putting grand theories into practice? And what part of these challenges, the economics, the politics, the human cost, stands out most to you? Something to think about.